Chapter 1. The blade breaks. The blade sang as it fell. Ferrus Manus had heard that sound before. The whistle of perfect steel cutting air, the whisper of death approaching with artistic precision. His brother had always been an artist with his weapons. Even now, even here, even with madness burning in Fulgrim's violet eyes, the Phoenician's form was flawless. But Ferrus was not made of flesh alone. The Gorgon's hands came up, not in a desperate block, but with the calculated precision of a master smith catching molten metal. The necrodermis that had fused with his flesh since his youth on Medusa responded to his will, flowing like liquid silver, even as it held the strength of adamantium. When Fulgrim's blade met those impossible hands, the universe held its breath. The sound that followed was not the wet crunch of a Primarch's death. It was the sharp crack of something breaking that should never break. Fulgrim's demon blade, that cursed thing he'd claimed from the lyre, that whispered such beautiful lies, shattered like glass against Ferrus's palms. Fragments of what had once been perfect steel scattered across the blackened ground of Isstvan Fifth, each piece smoking with demonic essence as it died. For a heartbeat, both brothers stood frozen. Fulgrim stared at the broken hilt in his hands, his perfect features contorting with an emotion too complex for any single word. Horror, relief, confusion. The purple corruption that had been spreading across his pale skin seemed to flicker, like a flame touched by wind. Then the demon that had been bound within the blade materialized between them, a writhing thing of silk and razors, beautiful and terrible, its form already beginning to dissipate without its anchor. It turned toward Fulgrim with what might have been accusation or hunger, but found no purchase on a soul suddenly flooded with his own will again. "No," Fulgrim whispered, and the daemon crumbled to ash. Ferrus felt the absence like a weight lifting from the air itself, the pressure that had been building behind his eyes, the sense of something watching from just beyond sight. Gone. His brother stood before him, swaying slightly, looking like a man who had just woken from a nightmare to find his hands bloody. "Brother," Ferrus said, and his voice carried none of the rage that had driven him across the killing field. Only sorrow. "What have they done to you?" Fulgrim's response was not words, but a sound, something between a sob and a laugh, neither entirely sane. I was going to kill you. I wanted to kill you. No, I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop wanting to, and He stumbled backward, perfect coordination, failing him for perhaps the first time in his life. "The things I've done, Ferrus, the things I've said, the things I've enjoyed." Around them, the drop site massacre continued its bloody work. Bolter fire echoed from the Urgal hills. Somewhere in the distance, a Titan's war horn sounded its mournful note. But here, in this small space between brothers, there was only the sound of Fulgrim falling to his knees. "Get up," Ferrus said, but not harshly. "We're not done here." The iron hands had seen their Primarch fall beneath Fulgrim's blade, or so it had seemed from a distance. Some had broken, their iron discipline cracking under the weight of loss. Others had simply become more iron still, advancing with mechanical precision even as their hearts shattered. But when word spread through their vox networks that the Gorgon lived, that he stood victorious while Fulgrim knelt in the ash, something changed in their advance. They weren't retreating anymore. They weren't dying anymore. They were doing what the Iron Hands had always done best, enduring and making their enemies pay for every inch of ground. Captain Santar of the First Company received the confirmation through his helmet's tactical display and allowed himself one moment of something that might have been joy. Then he began the process of turning slaughter into withdrawal, massacre into tactical redeployment. The Iron Hands would live to fight another day because their father lived to lead them. But Ferrus wasn't thinking about tactics as he looked down at his broken brother. He was thinking about the choice that lay before them both. Fulgrim could rise, could return to Horus's side, could pretend that nothing had changed, or he could rise and choose a different path. The decision, Ferrus realized, would echo through the galaxy for decades to come. "The Emperor forgives much," he said quietly. "Even this." Fulgrim looked up, tears cutting pale tracks through the grime on his face. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "None of us do," Ferrus replied. "That's what makes it grace." The sounds of battle were growing closer. Soon they would have to move, would have to make choices about survival and loyalty and the future of the Imperium. But for now, in this moment, two brothers shared the weight of what could have been lost forever. And somewhere in the ash and ruin of Isstvan, the first crack appeared in Horus's perfect plan. Chapter 2. Shattered Brothers. Fulgrim's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood in the command deck of the Pride of the Emperor, watching the tactical displays show the impossible. Loyalist forces withdrawing in good order instead of dying in the perfect trap he had helped spring. The Emperor's children around him moved with the precision he had drilled into them across 2 centuries of war. But their glances kept sliding toward him like worried children, checking on a parent who had started acting strangely. He couldn't blame them. He felt strange to himself. The memories were the worst part. Not the hazy, distant recollections of the past months, but the crystal-clear awareness of what he had done while the demon held his reins. Every cruelty enacted with artistic precision. Every moment of joy he'd taken in his brother's pain. Every choice he'd made that felt like wisdom, but tasted like poison. "My lord?" Captain Virusian approached with the careful steps of a man walking on glass. "The War Master requests an update on your engagement with the Gorgon." Fulgrim almost laughed. His engagement with Ferrus. What did you call it when you tried to murder your brother and instead found yourself freed from a hell you hadn't even realized you were in? "Tell the War Master that Ferrus Manus lives," he said, and watched his captain's perfect features shift through confusion toward something approaching horror. "My lord, I don't understand. The tactical augurs showed." The tactical augurs were wrong. Fulgrim turned from the displays, and Virusian took an involuntary step back. What did his sons see when they looked at him now? The corruption that had marked his skin was already fading, the unnatural enhancements starting to withdraw. But perhaps they sensed something deeper. Perhaps they could smell the fear on him. Shall I dispatch forces to correct this error?" Virusian's voice held the careful neutrality of a man trying not to reveal which answer he hoped for. "No." The word came out harder than Fulgrim intended. "Signal the withdrawal. All units. Immediate disengagement. Fall back to Rally Point Secundus." Silence fell over the command deck like a shroud. Fulgrim could feel the weight of unasked questions pressing against him from every direction. He had trained his sons to be perfect, to execute orders without hesitation, but he had also trained them to think, and any thinking warrior would recognize that these orders made no tactical sense, unless you understood that their Primarch was no longer the same man who had led them into this battle. "My lord," Virusian tried again, his voice carefully modulated. "The War Master's battle plan called for—" "The War Master's battle plan assumed many things." Fulgrim moved toward the observation deck, needing air that didn't taste of recycled fear. "Including my continued cooperation." He could have explained, could have told them about the demon blade, about the whispers that had grown from suggestions to commands to irresistible compulsions over these past months. could have described the moment when Ferrus's impossible hands had shattered more than just a weapon. They had shattered the chains around his soul. But how did you explain to your sons that you had been a prisoner in your own body? How did you tell them that every order you had given, every battle plan you had crafted, every moment of pride they had taken in following you, had been authored by something that fed on suffering? How did you tell them that you weren't sure who you were without the demon's voice in your head? Behind him, he heard Virusean speaking in low tones with the other officers. The words were carefully neutral, professionally concerned, but Fulgrim caught the undertone. They were worried about him. Not about the tactical situation, not about Horus's reaction. They were worried about their father's sanity. They weren't wrong to worry. The Vox array crackled with an incoming transmission, Priority Alpha. Horus's voice filled the command deck with its familiar authority, but Fulgrim heard something else beneath it now, a note of controlled frustration that the demon's presence had hidden from him before. "Fulgrim, report." "Brother." Fulgrim keyed the transmission for privacy, cutting out the rest of the command deck. "The situation has developed complications." "Explain." Such a simple word. Such an impossible request. "Ferrus lives. The Iron Hands are withdrawing, but they maintain combat effectiveness, estimated 40% strength remaining." Silence stretched across the Vox channel. When Horus spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a plan crumbling in real time. "How?" "I failed to kill him." The words tasted like confession, like the first honest thing he'd said in months. "You failed." Not a question, not quite an accusation, but Fulgrim heard the calculation behind it, the rapid reassessment of variables that had seemed fixed. "This complicates matters significantly." "Yes. We will discuss this further when you reach the rally point. For now, salvage what you can. The Salamanders and Raven Guard are still broken. See that they stay that way." The transmission ended, leaving Fulgrim alone with the weight of what he had just refused to do. In the old days, the days before the daemon, he would have obeyed without question. Horus was the war master, chosen by their father, and his strategic mind was beyond question. But those had been the days when Fulgrim's objections could be drowned in whispers of glory and perfection. Now he stood in silence, listening to his own thoughts for the first time in months, and they were screaming. He would not hunt down broken legions like a pack animal. He would not add to the slaughter that already stained Isstvan V's soil black, and he would not, could not, pretend that the thing wearing his face for these past months had been him. "Captain Virusean." "My lord?" "Signal the Emperor's children fleet. Full withdrawal. Best speed." "And Captain?" Fulgrim turned to meet his son's eyes, trying to show him something honest, something real. "If anyone questions these orders, tell them their Primarch has remembered who he serves." Virusean's expression shifted through confusion toward something that might have been relief. "And who is that, my lord?" Fulgrim looked out at the stars, thinking of Ferrus standing in the ash with forgiveness in his eyes. The Emperor, and the brothers worth saving. As the pride of the Emperor began its burn toward the system's edge, Fulgrim stood alone and tried to remember what it felt like to choose his own actions. The freedom was terrifying, but it was his. Chapter 3. The Iron Endures. 3 days after Isstvan 5, the Iron Hands were not supposed to exist. Captain Santar stood in the strategium of the Hand of Iron, watching tactical displays that should have been memorial shrines. 40% combat effectiveness. By any reasonable standard, they were a broken force, crippled, demoralized, bleeding ships and material with every hour that passed. But reasonable standards had died when their Primarch caught a demon blade with his bare hands. "Status report," Ferrus said, entering the chamber with the measured pace of a man conserving energy for the battles ahead. 3 days of fighting withdrawal had worn lines into his face that centuries of war had never managed, but his presence still filled the space, like gravity made manifest. 15 strike cruisers, 47 escorts, and 63,000 legionaries, Santar reported. The clan companies maintained discipline during the extraction. Losses were significant, but sustainable. Sustainable. What a word to use for the deaths of 80,000 of their brothers. But it was accurate. They had enough ships to remain mobile, enough warriors to pose a threat, and most importantly, they had their Primarch. That changed everything. "Any word from our brothers?" "Lord Korax transmitted confirmation 6 hours ago. The Raven Guard maintains 38% strength and has established a fallback position in the Lycanthos system. Lord Vulcan—" Santar hesitated. "Lord Vulcan's status remains unclear. Last reports placed him in the thick of the fighting near Score Ridge." Ferrus nodded slowly. Vulcan's perpetual nature was not widely known, even among the Primarchs, but Ferrus had suspected something for decades. His brother's willingness to accept impossible risks, the way he seemed to shrug off wounds that should have been fatal, it painted a pattern for those who knew how to look. "He will return to us," Ferrus said, with quiet certainty. "Vulcan is harder to kill than most realize. In the meantime, we plan as though we stand alone." The Strategium's main display shifted to show the Isstvan system, now crawling with traitor fleets. Horus had committed 9 full legions to his trap, but the prey had proven more elusive than expected. Instead of 3 broken forces bleeding themselves to death in futile last stands, he faced the prospect of coordinated resistance from 3 of the most tactically sophisticated Primarchs in the Imperium. "The word-bearers have established a supply depot here," Ferrus indicated a system 3 jumps spinward. "Lorgar's sons always did prefer to fight from prepared positions. They've been feeding material to the Iron Warriors' siege operations for months." Santa studied the display with the eye of a veteran void warfare specialist. "It's well defended. 3 battle barges, escort squadrons, orbital defense platforms. A direct assault would be costly." "Who said anything about direct assault?" Ferrus touched another section of the display, highlighting shipping routes that fed into the depot. "The word-bearers think like conquerors. They see space as territory to be held. We think like smiths. We see weak points in the metal." Over the next hour, Ferrus laid out a plan that was audacious in its scope and surgical in its precision. The Iron Hands would strike not at the depot itself, but at the 3 critical supply convoys that kept it operational. Simultaneous attacks, coordinated down to the minute, designed to cripple the word-bearers' logistics while avoiding the kind of pitched battle that would favor Horus's numerical superiority. "It's not enough to hurt them," Ferrus explained, as his captains absorbed the operational details. "We need to make them bleed resources hunting us. Every ship they detach to guard supply lines is a ship they can't use to advance on Terra. Every garrison they reinforce is a garrison that isn't marching on our father's palace." The beauty of the plan wasn't just its tactical elegance, it was its sustainability. The Iron Hands had always excelled at void warfare and rapid deployment. With their fleet assets largely intact, they could strike and withdraw before the enemy could respond in force. More importantly, they could coordinate with the other shattered legions to multiply their effectiveness. "What about forge assets?" asked Techmarine Vorth, his mechadendrites clicking as he interfaced with the ship's manufacturing data. "Our production capacity is severely limited." Ferrus smiled, and for the first time since Isstvan, It reached his eyes. "Then we take what we need. The Iron Warriors aren't the only legion that knows how to adapt battlefield salvage. And unlike Perturabo's sons, we remember that the machine serves the warrior, not the other way around." Within the hour, the Hand of Iron's forges were working at full capacity, converting salvaged traitor material into weapons that would serve the loyal cause. Ferrus moved through the manufacturing decks personally, his necrodermis hands shaping metal with a precision that awed even his veteran artificers. Bolter rounds became melter charges. Destroyed armor plating became reinforcement for boarding shields. Nothing was wasted. But the most important transformation was happening in the hearts of his warriors. The Iron Hands had entered the Isstvan system as a proud but insular legion, focused on their own perfection and dismissive of weakness in others. They were leaving as something new, a force that understood survival meant cooperation, that strength came not from individual excellence, but from unbreakable bonds between brothers. The first convoy died without ever knowing they were under attack. Iron Hands boarding torpedoes struck simultaneously across a dozen supply ships, their warriors moving through the corridors like shadows made of ceramite and rage. By the time the word-bearers realized what was happening, the convoy's cargo was already being transferred to Iron Hands vessels. The second convoy tried to fight. The result was uglier, but no less decisive. The Iron Hands had learned new lessons in the crucible of Isstvan, lessons about speed over strength, about striking at the enemy's weakest points rather than challenging their strongest. When the smoke cleared, another vital supply line had been severed. The third convoy never made it to the rendezvous. Warned by their losses, they attempted to change course, only to discover that the Iron Hands had anticipated their movements. Ferrus himself led the boarding action, his massive form moving through the enemy ship like an unstoppable force of nature. The word-bearers found themselves facing not just a Primarch, but a Primarch who had been tempered by loss and emerged stronger for it. When the reports reached the traitor command, they painted a disturbing picture. The Iron Hands weren't dying. They weren't bleeding out in desperate last stands. They were adapting, evolving, becoming something that Horus's perfect plan had never accounted for. A threat that grew more dangerous with every passing day. "Impossible," Horus said, studying the tactical reports in the Strategium of the Vengeful Spirit. "Ferrus leads a broken force. They should be seeking safe harbor, not conducting offensive operations." "Perhaps," Malagurst ventured carefully, "the Gorgon's survival has changed their strategic calculus." Horus turned to look at his equerry, and for a moment, something almost like uncertainty flickered in the War Master's eyes. The plan had been perfect. Every variable accounted for. Every loyalist response predicted and countered. Every response except this one. "Deploy the 8th and 17th to hunt them down," Horus commanded. "I want the Iron Hands found and destroyed. No more half measures." As the orders went out, neither the War Master nor his equerry spoke the thought that hung between them like a blade. They were committing 2 full legions to hunt down the remnants of one. In any campaign, that represented a significant strategic cost, but then no one had planned for Ferrus Manus to survive his brother's blade. In the void between stars, the Hand of Iron set course for the rendezvous coordinates Korax had provided. Behind them, they left a trail of broken supply lines and burning wrecks. Ahead lay the prospect of coordination with their surviving brothers. The Iron Hands had endured. Now it was time to see if they could do more than simply survive. The hunt was only beginning. Chapter 4. The Burden of Choice. 27 days after Isstvan 5, Fulgrim discovered that freedom was heavier than chains. He stood alone in his private chambers aboard the Pride of the Emperor, staring at a message he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The Vox transmitter on his desk could reach across half the galaxy if properly configured, but the 6 words glowing on the screen seemed to mock him with their inadequacy. "Brother, I remember who I am." Such a simple thing to say. Such an impossible thing to transmit. Every word would be monitored, analyzed, dissected by 100 different intelligence networks. Horus's people, Malkador's people, and increasingly, the whisper suggested, people who served powers that were neither imperial nor merely human. But Ferrus deserved to know, deserved to understand that the brother who had tried to kill him was gone, banished with the demon that had worn his face. The question was whether the brother who remained was worth saving. A soft chime indicated someone requesting entry. Fulgrim blanked the screen with a thought and called for them to enter. Captain Virosean appeared in the doorway, his perfect features carrying an expression of carefully controlled concern. "My lord, Lord Commander Eidolon, requests an audience." Fulgrim almost smiled at that. Requests, as though Eidolon had ever truly requested anything in his long, ambitious life. "Send him in." Eidolon entered with the predatory grace that had always marked him. But there was something different now. Something that made Fulgrim's skin crawl in ways that demon possession never had. His armor showed subtle modifications, curves that pleased the eye too much, sounds that harmonized in ways that made the listener want to hear more. Slaaneshi corruption, artfully applied. "My Lord Primarch." Eidolon's voice carried new harmonics, layers of meaning that slid past the ear like silk across skin. "We need to discuss the Legion's current direction." "Do we?" Fulgrim remained standing, putting his enhanced height to use. It was a petty power play, but Eidolon had always understood petty power plays better than grand strategy. "And what direction would that be, Lord Commander? Away from glory, away from perfection, away from the path the Legion has walked for 2 centuries. Eidolon stepped closer, and Fulgrim caught the scent of something that might have been incense, but carried undertones of decay and desire. "The men are confused, my lord. They signed on for a war of liberation. Instead, we withdraw from battles, ignore strategic objectives, refuse to press advantages. They begin to wonder if their Primarch has lost his nerve." The words were carefully chosen, each one designed to probe for weakness. Fulgrim had trained Eidolon too well in the arts of manipulation. Unfortunately for the Lord Commander, he had also trained him to be readable. "And what do you suggest, old friend?" "Return to our purpose. Horus leads us toward a new order, one where humanity can achieve its true potential. The Emperor's vision was limited, constrained by fear of what we might become. But we have seen beyond those constraints." Eidolon's smile was perfect in every detail save one. It never touched his eyes. "The men need to see that their Primarch still pursues perfection, not mediocrity." There it was, the offer wrapped in velvet and barbed with promises. Fulgrim could see the shape of it clearly now. Eidolon positioning himself as the voice of the true Emperor's children, the faction that had embraced the gifts chaos offered, while their Primarch wallowed in sentiment and weakness. "And if I choose a different path?" "Then perhaps," Eidolon said carefully, "it is time for the Legion to choose new leadership. The War Master values loyalty above all else. He would understand if the Emperor's children required restructuring." The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Fulgrim felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. This was the moment he had dreaded since awakening from the daemon's influence. The moment when he would have to choose between the easy path of damnation and the hard road of redemption. "Leave me," he said quietly. "I need time to consider." Eidolon's bow was a masterwork of mockery disguised as respect. "Of course, my lord, but do not take too long. The Legion grows restless." Alone again, Fulgrim activated his private Vox array and began the delicate work of configuring an untraceable transmission. It took 3 hours and required technical knowledge he'd acquired during the worst days of his possession, when the daemon had used him to coordinate with entities best left unnamed. But eventually, he had a channel that would reach Iron Hand's space without passing through any monitored networks. The message he finally sent was longer than his first attempt, but barely. "Brother, the chains are broken, but the damage remains. My sons are not all mine anymore. Some follow paths I cannot walk. If there is a way back from this darkness, I cannot find it alone. Your brother in shame, if not in honor. F." 3 hours later, the reply came through the same untraceable channel. "Fulgrim, the Emperor judges the heart, not the past. There is always a way back for those who seek it. Your brother in hope, if not yet in trust. F." Fulgrim read the message 17 times before deleting it. Hope. Such a small word to carry such enormous weight. But it was more than he had felt in months. The next morning brought reports that made Eidolon's challenge look like a minor disagreement. Half the Legion's companies had requested reassignment to more aggressive commands. Supply requisitions showed massive increases in exotic materials, things that had no place in standard military operations, but would be essential for the kinds of rituals that had become popular among certain factions. Captain Virusean delivered the reports with the air of a man reporting a plague outbreak. "My lord, I fear we may be looking at a complete schism. The traditionalists remain loyal to you, but Eidolon has been persuasive with the younger officers." "How persuasive?" "3rd Company declared for him yesterday. 7th is wavering, and there are rumors." Virusean hesitated. "Speak freely, Captain." "Rumors that some companies are conducting their own operations, raids that serve no strategic purpose we can identify. Taking prisoners they won't transfer to Legion-holding facilities. My lord, I fear they are no longer fighting the Emperor's enemies." Fulgrim closed his eyes and tried not to think about what Eidolon's version of perfection might involve. The demon's memories were still there, carefully locked away, but available if he chose to look. He knew exactly what kinds of raids served no strategic purpose, but fed other hungers entirely. "Send word to Lord Commander Eidolon," he said finally. "Tell him I've made my decision regarding the Legion's direction." Virusean waited, but Fulgrim said nothing more. Some decisions he was learning carried more weight when announced to the right audience. The confrontation came that evening in the pride of the Emperor's primary strategium. Eidolon arrived with his supporters, a full third of the Legion's command structure, Fulgrim noted with sick recognition. They arranged themselves with the casual precision of predators dividing territory. "Lord Commander," Fulgrim began, his voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of centuries. "You asked me to choose a direction for our Legion. I have." Eidolon smiled that perfect empty smile. "And? We serve the Imperium. We serve the Emperor. We do not serve the whispers that promise easy power at the cost of our souls." Fulgrim looked directly at Eidolon as he spoke, making sure every word hit its target. Those who disagree are welcome to seek transfer to other commands. Those who refuse transfer will be considered traitors to the Legion and dealt with accordingly. The silence that followed was absolute. Fulgrim could see the calculations running behind Eidolon's eyes. Risk versus reward, loyalty versus ambition, the quick path to power against the longer road of conventional advancement. "My lord," Eidolon said at last, and his voice carried new harmonics that made several officers step backward involuntarily. "I fear you have become unwell. The burdens of command, perhaps. The trauma of recent events. Surely a period of rest." "Lord Commander Eidolon," Fulgrim interrupted, and this time his voice carried the full authority of a Primarch pushed beyond patience. "You are relieved of duty. Captain Virusaean, escort the former Lord Commander to quarters pending transfer." Eidolon's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something underneath that was anything but human. "You think you can simply cast aside the gifts we've been offered? You think the powers that elevated you will simply forgive this betrayal?" "I think," Fulgrim said quietly, "that I would rather face damnation as myself than salvation as something else's puppet." As Virusaean's guards moved to escort Eidolon out, the former Lord Commander turned back one last time. "This is not over, Primarch. The Legion knows who truly serves perfection, and when Horus calls for explanations about our reluctance to pursue certain objectives, what will you tell him?" Fulgrim met his gaze steadily. "That some prices are too high to pay, even for victory." After they were gone, Fulgrim stood alone in the strategium and tried not to calculate how many of his sons he had just lost to the very corruption he had once embraced. The number was higher than he wanted to contemplate, but for the first time since Isstvan 5, he felt like the man giving the orders was actually him. Outside, in the deep void between stars, the Emperor's children fleet began the long, careful process of dividing itself in two. Some ships followed their Primarch toward an uncertain redemption. Others followed their new masters toward a perfection that consumed everything it touched. The Legion was broken, but perhaps, Fulgrim thought, some things needed to break before they could heal. Chapter 5. Forge of War. The asteroid had been dead for 10 million years before Ferrus Manus gave it purpose. He stood in the center of what had once been a nickel-iron core, now hollowed out and transformed into something the Mechanicum would have called impossible. Forge fires burned without atmosphere, tended by servitors whose modifications pushed the boundaries between flesh and machine. The air itself hummed with the resonance of molecular forges, working at frequencies that made reality itself more malleable. "Show me," he said to Techmarine Vorth, who stood beside a workbench that held the fragments of a demon blade. Vorth's mechadendrites clicked as they interfaced with the analysis cogitators, projecting hololithic displays that painted the chamber in shifting blues and golds. "The metallurgy is complex, my lord. The base material appears to be standard ceramite-bonded steel, but the molecular structure has been altered at a fundamental level. Warp-tainted, certainly, but not in any way our previous studies would suggest." Ferrus reached out to touch one of the larger fragments, his necrodermis fingers probing the metal's essence with senses no baseline human possessed. The demon was gone, banished the moment the blade shattered, but its presence had left scars in the very atoms, patterns that spoke of hunger and ambition and the terrible mathematics of corruption. "It's not just tainted," he murmured. "It's been rewritten. The demon didn't just inhabit the weapon, it changed what the weapon fundamentally was. Look at these stress patterns. The metal was trying to become something else entirely." Understanding dawned in Vorth's augmetic eyes. "And if we can understand how the corruption rewrites matter, then we can forge weapons that do the same thing in reverse." Ferrus lifted a different fragment, this one glowing with a faint silver light. Where his necrodermis hands touched it, the corruption patterns began to unravel, leaving behind metal that sang with purity. The warp changes everything it touches, but change works both ways. It had taken 3 weeks to establish the Forge asteroid, hidden in the debris field of a shattered world on the outer rim of the Isstvan system. Another week to gather the materials and knowledge needed for the work ahead. But now, 8 weeks after the drop site massacre that should have ended them all, the Iron Hands were building weapons that could cut the heart out of Horus's rebellion. The first prototype lay on the primary workbench, a bolter that looked unremarkable until you understood what the Gorgon had done to its firing mechanism. Each round was inscribed with microcircuit patterns that echoed the mathematical structures Ferrus had found in the demon blade's corruption. But where the demon had used those patterns to spread hunger and pain, these rounds carried their opposite: order, clarity, the absolute rejection of chaos in all its forms. "Field test results?" Ferrus asked. Captain Santar consulted his data slate with the expression of a man still processing the impossible. 100% effectiveness against corrupted targets, my lord. The test subjects weren't just killed, they were cleansed. Whatever taint they carried was burned away at the molecular level. Ferrus nodded slowly. It was exactly what he had hoped for, and exactly what he had feared. Weapons this powerful would be desperately needed in the battles ahead. But the knowledge required to create them walked the edge between salvation and damnation. One miscalculation, one moment of hubris, and he could create something worse than the demon blade he had shattered. That was why he had called for help. "Lord Corax's ship is requesting docking clearance," Vorth reported. "Shall I grant it?" "Yes, and prepare the secondary workshop for demonstration. Our brothers need to see what we've learned." 20 minutes later, Ferrus stood before 2 of the finest military minds in the Imperium. Corvus Corax moved through the asteroid forge with the careful steps of a man who trusted nothing and questioned everything. Vulcan's massive presence filled the chamber with warmth that had nothing to do with the forge fires burning around them. "Brother," Vulcan said, his voice carrying the relief of a man who had died and returned to find his family still whole. "I had heard rumors, but seeing you here," he gestured at the impossible forge around them. "This changes everything." "How?" Corax asked, ever practical. "Don't mistake me. I'm grateful beyond words that you survived Fulgrim's blade. But 3 Primarchs and what remains of our legions cannot match 9 traitor legions in open battle. We need more than superior technology. We need a strategy that multiplies our effectiveness." Ferrus smiled and lifted the prototype bolter. "Then let me show you what multiplication looks like." The demonstration took an hour. By the end, both Primarchs understood exactly what the Iron Hands had accomplished. More importantly, they understood what it could mean for the war ahead. "Anti-demon rounds," Vulcan breathed, holding one of the prototype ammunition casings up to the forge light. "My smiths have been working for months to create weapons that could hurt the entities our enemies are summoning. This doesn't just hurt them. It unmakes them." "And the manufacturing process?" Corax asked, with the precision of a man calculating logistics. "Complex, but scalable," Ferrus replied. "Each round requires individual micro-inscription, which limits production speed. But the process can be taught. Your artificers, Vulcan's master smiths, they can learn to replicate this work." "How long?" "For basic competency. 6 weeks of intensive training. For true mastery." Ferrus shrugged. "Years, but we don't need mastery. We need enough ammunition to arm 3 legions for the battles ahead." Over the following days, the asteroid forge became something unprecedented in Imperial history, a joint research facility operated by 3 different legions working in perfect coordination. Salamander smiths brought their expertise in exotic metallurgy. Raven Guard tech marines contributed stealth technology and microelectronics. Iron Hands artificers provided the theoretical framework and manufacturing precision. The results exceeded even Ferrus's expectations. The Gorgon pattern bolter was just the beginning. Within a week, they had developed anti-corruption field generators that could cleanse tainted machinery, salamander-forged armor plating that actively resisted warp-based attacks, Raven Guard stealth systems that couldn't be detected by demonically enhanced senses. But the real breakthrough came when Vulcan made a suggestion that changed everything. "We're thinking too small," he said, during a strategy session in the Asteroids Command Center. "These weapons are magnificent, but they're still just weapons. What if we applied the same principles to our ships, our equipment, our very armor?" Ferrus looked up from the forge schematic he'd been studying. "You're talking about systematic anti-corruption engineering. Every system, every component, designed to resist chaos influence at the molecular level." "More than resist," Corax added, his tactical mind already leaping ahead. "Imagine boarding actions where our mere presence begins to cleanse corrupted ships. Picture the psychological impact on traitor forces when they realize their own weapons are turning against them." The implications were staggering. If they could implement systematic anti-corruption engineering across their combined fleets, the Shattered Legions wouldn't just be survivors. They would be a weapon pointed at the heart of everything Horus represented. "It would take months," Ferrus warned, "maybe years to fully implement, and the resource requirements would be worth it," Vulcan finished. "Brother, this could change the nature of the war itself. Instead of fighting to survive, we'd be fighting to win." That night, alone in his private quarters, Ferrus composed another message to Fulgrim. The communication protocols were more sophisticated now. Corax's intelligence networks had provided encryption systems that could penetrate even Horus's most secure channels. "Brother, the gift you unknowingly gave me grows beyond what either of us imagined. Your demon blade held secrets that may save the Imperium. I hope someday to repay that debt. Your brother in war, if not yet in peace. F." The reply came 6 hours later. "Ferrus, if my suffering can serve our father's cause, then perhaps it was not entirely in vain. There are others among the traitors who remember their oaths. When the time comes, you will not fight alone. Your brother in hope. F." As the asteroid forge hummed with the sound of 3 legions working in perfect unity, Ferrus allowed himself a moment of something that might have been optimism. The drop site massacre had been meant to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something new, something Horus had never planned for and could never truly counter. The Shattered Legions were learning to fight a different kind of war, and for the first time since Isstvan V, they might actually win it. In the depths of space, other forges began to burn. Hidden facilities in dead systems, mobile manufacturing ships that could appear without warning and vanish before pursuit arrived. The Iron Hands gift was spreading, multiplying, becoming something larger than any single legion could contain. The age of miracles was ending. The age of engineered impossibilities had begun. And somewhere in the warp, the entities that fed on corruption felt the first stirrings of something they had not experienced in millennia. Doubt. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Coil. The summons came at the worst possible time. Fulgrim stood in the strategium of the Pride of the Emperor, watching tactical displays that painted a picture of his legion tearing itself apart. 3 companies had declared for Eidolon in the past week. 7 more had formally requested transfer to other commands, rather than serve under either faction. The Emperor's children were becoming a memory, fractured beyond any hope of reunion. And now Horus wanted to talk. "My lord?" Captain Virusaean's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had grown skilled at reading his Primarch's moods. "The War Master's shuttle will dock in 20 minutes. Security protocols? Standard honors, Fulgrim replied, not taking his eyes from the displays. And Captain? Have Sergeant Lucas's squad standing by. Quietly. Virusian's expression didn't change, but Fulgrim caught the slight shift in his posture. His most loyal captain understood exactly what those orders meant. If this meeting went badly, they might need to fight their way out of their own ship. 23 minutes later, Horus Lupercal entered the pride of the Emperor with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. The War Master wore simple armor, carried no visible weapons, and moved with the easy grace that had made him beloved by 9 legions. But Fulgrim had learned to see past surfaces, and what he saw now made his skin crawl. There was something else riding behind Horus's eyes, something that watched with ancient hunger and whispered promises in languages older than humanity. The demon might be gone from Fulgrim's own soul, but he had learned to recognize its presence in others' brother. Horus's voice carried the warmth that had once made Fulgrim feel like the most important person in the galaxy. You look troubled. Do I? Fulgrim gestured for his brother to join him at the tactical display. Perhaps it's because my legion is destroying itself while I watch. Ah. Horus studied the fleet disposition with the eye of a master strategist. Eidolon's rebellion. I had heard rumors. Had you? Fulgrim kept his voice carefully neutral. And what did these rumors tell you about my performance as a legion commander? Horus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the tactical display to Fulgrim's face with the precision of a surgeon's blade. They told me that my brother might be having difficulties adjusting to the new paradigm, that the burdens of our cause might be weighing on him more heavily than expected. The new paradigm. Fulgrim tasted the words like poison. Is that what we're calling it now? Fulgrim. The warmth in Horus's voice took on an edge that could cut steel. I came here out of concern for you. The 3rd Legion has been underperforming in recent operations. Ships arriving late to engagements. Supply convoys rerouted without authorization. Intelligence reports filed with suspicious delays. Your officers are starting to ask questions. Perhaps, Fulgrim said carefully, my officers should focus on their own duties rather than gossiping about mine. Horus stepped closer, and Fulgrim felt the weight of his brother's presence, like a physical force. When the War Master spoke again, his voice carried undertones that made the air itself seem thicker. Brother, I need to know that I can count on you. The path we've chosen requires absolute commitment. There can be no half measures, no reservations, no looking back at what we've left behind. And if I have reservations, then you work through them, or they work through you. Horus placed a hand on Fulgrim's shoulder, and Fulgrim had to fight not to recoil from the contact. There was something wrong with his brother's touch now, something that felt like ice wrapped in silk. The powers that support our cause are particular about loyalty. They reward faith beyond measure, but they have no patience for doubt. Fulgrim met his brother's eyes and saw galaxies burning behind them. I understand. Do you? Horus studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. Good. Because I have an assignment for you. The Salamanders have established a supply depot in the Nocturne system. Small target, lightly defended. Perfect for the 3rd Legion to rediscover its aggressive spirit. The order hung in the air between them like a test. Fulgrim knew exactly what Horus was asking. Not just an attack on loyalist forces, but participation in the kind of operation that would cement his commitment to the rebellion, the kind of operation that would make reconciliation impossible. Consider it done, he said, and watched something that might have been satisfaction flicker in Horus's eyes. After the War Master left, Fulgrim stood alone in his strategium and tried not to think about what he had just agreed to. But solitude was a luxury he couldn't afford. Within minutes, the chamber's doors chimed again, and Captain Virusean entered with an expression of barely controlled urgency. "My lord, we've received a transmission. Long range, heavily encrypted. Iron Hands authentication codes." Fulgrim's breath caught. "Show me." The hololithic display materialized in the center of the chamber, showing the weathered features of an Iron Hands captain Fulgrim didn't recognize. But the man's words carried the unmistakable authority of someone speaking for his Primarch. "Lord Fulgrim, I am Captain Santar of the Iron Hands First Company. My Primarch has asked me to convey a message that he believes you will understand." The transmission shifted, and suddenly Fulgrim was looking at a weapon unlike anything he had ever seen. The bolter in the display seemed to sing with purpose, its very presence radiating a sense of order that made his soul ache with longing. This weapon was forged using insights gained from the destruction of a demon blade on Isstvan Fef, Santa continued. "Lord Ferrus wishes you to know that even the deepest corruption can be purified, given the proper application of will and brotherhood. If you desire to discuss the technical specifications of this purification process, he will be available for communication on the enclosed frequencies." The transmission ended, leaving Fulgrim staring at the space where hope had briefly materialized. Technical specifications. Such clinical words to describe salvation. But before he could fully process what he had seen, the strategium's alarms began to wail. Captain Virusean's hands flew over his control surfaces, pulling up tactical displays that painted the chamber in urgent red light. "My lord, we have multiple contacts approaching. Emperor's children vessels, but they're not responding to hails." Fulgrim didn't need to see the ship identifications to know what was happening. Eidolon had finally made his move. "Battle stations," he ordered, his voice carrying across the ship's communication system with absolute authority. "All loyal Emperor's children vessels, form up for defensive action. Priority transmission to all units. This is your Primarch speaking. The Legion stands at a crossroads. Choose carefully which path you will walk." The battle that followed was unlike anything in the Third Legion's proud history. Purple and gold ships that had fought side by side for 2 centuries turned their guns on each other in the dark between stars. Brothers who had shared victories across 100 worlds tried to kill each other with the precision their Primarch had taught them. Fulgrim stood on his command deck and watched his life's work destroy itself. Ships bearing his heraldry and his teachings, crewed by sons he had raised from novices, burning and dying in the void while he tried to choose between damnation and hope. The decision came when Eidolon's flagship, the Cacophony, broke through the Loyalist screen and began its attack run on the pride of the Emperor. Fulgrim could see his former Lord Commander on the enemy ship's bridge through the tactical display, a figure that barely resembled the proud warrior he had once been. Chaos had remade Eidolon into something that was all appetite and ambition, beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers were beautiful. "Lord Primarch," Eidolon's voice echoed across the Vox channels, carrying harmonics that made several bridge officers step backward in revulsion. "You have led our Legion into weakness, but the Third remembers what it means to pursue perfection. Join us, or burn with the failures." Fulgrim looked at the tactical display showing his fragmenting Legion, then at the weapon specifications Ferrus had sent him, then at the faces of the officers who still believed in the Emperor's dream. The choice, when it came, was easier than he had expected. "All Loyalist vessels, implement Santa Protocol on my mark," he commanded, using a code phrase that would mean nothing to Eidolon's forces, but everything to the ships that still served him. "Target the Cacophony. Show them what perfection really looks like. The pride of the Emperor's guns spoke with a voice that had never been heard before in Imperial space. The sound of purification made manifest. Where the shells struck Eidolon's flagship, corruption burned away like fog before the sun. The demon-touched modifications that had turned the cacophony into something obscene began to fail, leaving behind a ship that suddenly remembered what it had been built to serve. Eidolon's scream of rage and disbelief echoed across the Vox channels as his perfect vessel turned into something clean and imperial, and utterly opposed to everything he had become. "Impossible!" he howled. "The gifts of the Prince of Excess cannot be undone. We are perfection incarnate. You are parasites," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying across the battlefield with absolute certainty. And parasites burn. The battle lasted another 3 hours. When it ended, Eidolon's rebellion was broken, his ships either destroyed or cleansed of their corruption. The Emperor's children's civil war was over, not because one side had won, but because Fulgrim had shown them all a third option. That night, as the surviving ships of the Third Legion limped toward a rendezvous with Iron Hand's forces, Fulgrim composed a message to his brother. It was longer than any he had sent before, but the weight of what had happened demanded proper words. "Ferrus, your gift has given me the strength to choose who I wish to be. Half my sons followed me into the light. The other half—" He paused, thinking of the ships that had burned rather than accept purification. "The other half chose damnation, but those who remain remember their oaths. When you stand against the darkness, we will stand with you, your brother in service, no longer in shame. F." The reply came within hours. "Fulgrim, welcome home, brother. Welcome home. F." As the pride of the Emperor set course for Iron Hand's space, Fulgrim allowed himself something he hadn't felt since Lair, the simple peace of knowing that the man giving the orders was actually him. The Serpent had finally chosen which master to serve. Chapter 7. The Emperor's Hammer. The message that changed everything arrived on Terra at 0347 Imperial Standard, transmitted through an Iron Hand's communications network that shouldn't have existed. Rogel Dawn stood in the Phalanx's primary strategium, watching the hololithic display cycle through intelligence reports that painted an impossible picture. 3 months ago, the Gorgon had been dead, his legion shattered, the loyalist cause crippled beyond repair. Now the same reports spoke of coordinated resistance operations, technological innovations that bordered on miraculous and most unbelievable of all, Fulgrim's apparent defection from the traitor cause. "Confirm authenticity," he ordered Captain Sigismund, who stood at his shoulder with the unshakable presence that had made him the first captain of the Imperial Fists. "Genetic markers match Ferrus Manus, my lord. Voice print analysis confirms 99.7% probability. The transmission originated from coordinates consistent with Iron Hand's operational patterns." Sigismund paused, his scarred features reflecting the same disbelief that Dawn felt. "The intelligence is genuine." Dawn nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the strategic implications. The drop site massacre had been more than a military defeat. It had been a psychological blow that sent shock waves through every loyalist force in the galaxy. The loss of Ferrus, the shattering of 3 entire legions, the seeming invincibility of Horus's rebellion. But if the Gorgon lived, if the shattered legions fought on, if even one of the traitor Primarchs could be turned, "Signal the palace," he commanded. "Priority Alpha. I need to speak with the Regent immediately." 20 minutes later, Dawn stood in the Forbidden Fortress's inner sanctum, watching Malkador the Sigillite read intelligence reports that would reshape the war. The ancient Psyker's face revealed nothing, but Dawn had served alongside him long enough to read the subtle signs, the slight widening of eyes, the pause between breaths, the way his fingers drummed once against the desk's surface. "Remarkable," Malcador said finally. We had written off the shattered legions entirely, assumed they would spend whatever strength remained in futile last stands or fade into irrelevance. Instead, they appear to have become more dangerous than they ever were at full strength. The technology described here, Dawn indicated a section of the report dealing with anti-corruption weapons, could change the fundamental nature of the war. If we can mass-produce anti-daemon munitions, fortify our positions against warp-based attacks, Malcador leaned back in his chair, his ancient eyes reflecting the weight of 10,000 years of careful planning. The question is whether we can afford to commit resources to support them. Horus advances on multiple fronts. Our defensive positions require constant reinforcement. Can we spare the materials they need? Dawn considered the question with the methodical precision that had made him the Imperium's greatest fortress builder. Can we afford not to? 3 Primarchs coordinating resistance operations behind enemy lines, anti-corruption technology that could neutralize Horus's greatest advantages, and now, potentially, Fulgrim's forces as well. Potentially, Malcador emphasized. Fulgrim's claimed redemption could be an elaborate deception, a way to infiltrate loyalist forces when conventional assault has failed. Possible, but unlikely. Dawn pulled up tactical displays showing the reported battle between Emperor's children factions. The intelligence suggests Fulgrim destroyed a significant portion of his own legion to purge chaos corruption. Either he is committed to the most costly deception in military history, or his conversion is genuine. Malcador was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he contemplated possibilities that stretched across star systems and through the currents of the warp itself. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of the Emperor's voice. Draft authorization for Operation Gorgon's Gift. Priority requisitions for exotic materials, advanced manufacturing equipment, and whatever personnel the shattered legions require. If Ferrus Manus has found a way to weaponize purity itself, then we will give him the tools to forge that weapon. The orders went out within hours, carried by the most secure networks the Imperium possessed. But some news travels faster than official channels, spreading through the whispered conversations of desperate people who hunger for hope in dark times. On Medusa, the Iron Hands clanholds that had mourned their Primarch's death for months suddenly erupted in celebration. Forge fires that had burned low with grief blazed to life with renewed purpose. Recruitment doubled overnight as young men and women sought to join the legion that had somehow achieved the impossible. In the Raven Guard's recruiting worlds, resistance cells that had been operating in isolation suddenly found themselves coordinating with forces they hadn't known existed. Supply drops appeared without warning in locations known only to local commanders. Equipment manifested that bore the mark of technologies beyond anything they had seen. The salamander homeworld of Nocturne saw pilgrimages that defied imperial logistics, civilian ships arriving from across the sector, carrying refugees who spoke of seeing the Forge Fathers work in distant battles, of weapons that burned with the light of stars made manifest. But it was on the imperial worlds caught behind enemy lines that the real change became visible. Lord General Corvanus of the 47th Vostroyan Firstborn had been preparing for his final battle when the astropathic message reached his command bunker. The traitor forces had been closing on his position for weeks, overwhelming everything in their path with demons that laughed at conventional weapons and space marines who had forgotten what humanity meant. The message was brief. Hold fast. The Gorgon lives. Purity comes. 12 hours later, the sky above his position lit up with the contrails of weapons that burned the very air through which they passed. Iron hands strike craft screaming down from orbit, their ammunition loadouts cycling through rounds that made the daemons scream, not with pain but with fear. Salamander jump pack troops materializing from nowhere, their weapons carving through corrupted space marines like a blade through shadow. Raven Guard operatives appearing in the enemy's rear areas, sowing confusion with equipment that turned the traitors' own corruption against them. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, Corvanus stood in a field of ash and purified metal, watching space marines who should have been dead months ago, coordinating the evacuation of Imperial civilians to safety. Similar scenes played out across a dozen worlds. 100. The shattered legions were not just surviving, they were winning. More importantly, they were being seen to win, their victories spreading hope through populations that had given up believing in rescue. On the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus Lupercal studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of his perfect strategy unraveling in real time. The psychological warfare value of the drop site massacre had been immense. Visible proof that the Loyalists could be broken, that the Emperor's favored sons were not invincible. But now those same psychological advantages were working against him. "How many worlds have declared renewed loyalty to Terra?" he asked Malaghurst, his voice carrying an edge that made his equerry step backward involuntarily. 17 confirmed, War Master. Another 37 showing signs of resistance activity that suggests coordinated support. And our own recruitment numbers. Malaghurst consulted his data slate with the expression of a man delivering news he wished he could change. Down 37% across all theaters. The prospect of facing weapons that can undo corruption has made many potential converts reconsider their choices. Horus turned to stare out at the stars, his mind racing through calculations that grew more disturbing with every iteration. The drop site massacre had been perfect. 3 legions broken, the Loyalist cause crippled, the path to Terra wide open. But perfection, he was learning, was a fragile thing. A single moment of unexpected resilience, Ferrus catching a demon blade that should have ended him, had cascaded into consequences that threatened to undermine everything they had achieved. The Gorgon's survival had given hope to forces that should have despaired. Worse, it had demonstrated that chaos could be fought, that corruption could be cleansed, that the inevitable victory of the Dark Gods was nothing of the sort. "Signal the 1,000 Suns and the World Eaters," Horus commanded. "I want the shattered legions found and destroyed. Whatever resources are required, whatever risks must be taken. They are no longer a broken force to be ignored. They are the most dangerous threat to our cause." Malaghurst nodded and began composing the orders, but both he and his Primarch understood the strategic reality. Committing 2 full legions to hunt down an enemy that specialized in hit-and-run tactics would slow the advance on Terra significantly. Resources that should have been preparing for the final assault would instead be diverted to a campaign that might last months. The shattered legions had done something that no Loyalist force had managed since the rebellion began. They had forced Horus to react to them instead of implementing his own plans. As the orders went out to begin the hunt, neither the War Master nor his equerry spoke the thought that hung between them like a blade. For the first time since Devon, victory was no longer inevitable. It was simply possible. And possibility, as any student of warfare knew, cut both ways. On Terra, in the depths of the palace, where few were permitted to venture, the Emperor of mankind sat in contemplation before the half-completed apparatus of the Webway Gate. His awareness stretched across the galaxy, touching the minds of his sons, feeling the currents of the warp shift in response to hope reborn and corruption challenged. In the darkness behind closed eyes, he smiled. The Gorgon had always been his most pragmatic son. Trust Ferrus to find a way to turn death itself into a weapon for the living. Chapter 8. Brothers in Adamantium. The Triarch Pact was signed in blood, fire, and shadow. Ferrus Manus stood in the center of the asteroid forge's main chamber, watching his brothers add their marks to a document that would reshape the war. The ceremonial knife had drawn blood from 3 Primarchs, iron-scented from his own enhanced physiology, clean and sharp from Corax's pale flesh, warm as hearthstone from Vulcan's dark skin. Their genetic legacy mixed with molten adamantium in a ritual that was part imperial tradition, part desperate necessity. "By blood we are bound," Vulcan intoned, his voice carrying the weight of Nocturnian ritual. "By fire we are forged. By shadow we are hidden until the moment to strike." Corax nodded, his black eyes reflecting the forge fires. 3 legions. 1 purpose. 1 command structure. 1 will. He looked directly at Ferrus. 1 leader. The weight of that acknowledgement settled on Ferrus's shoulders like a mantle of ceremony. For 2 centuries, the Primarchs had been equals, brothers in arms but sovereign in their domains. No legion had ever submitted to another's command, outside of specific campaigns with predetermined durations. What they were creating here was unprecedented, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard and Salamanders are no more, Ferrus said, his words carrying across the chamber with the finality of a funeral bell. In their place stands something new, something Horus never planned for. He lifted the signed pact, its adamantium surface still warm from their blood. The shattered become the forge-born. The name had come to him during the weeks of planning that led to this moment. Not broken, forged anew in the crucible of betrayal and loss. Stronger for having been tested beyond their limits and refusing to break. Captain Santar stepped forward, representing the Iron Hands command structure. Beside him stood Captain Agapito of the Raven Guard and Artellus Numeon of the Salamanders. 3 men who had spent their lives serving single legions, now tasked with creating something entirely new. "The command structure has been finalized," Santa reported. "Iron Hands will provide heavy assault and technological support. Raven Guard will handle reconnaissance and surgical strikes. Salamanders will serve as our forge guard and defensive anchor. Cross-training begins immediately." Ferrus nodded. The logistics were staggering, integrating 3 different tactical doctrines, supply chains, communication protocols, and cultural traditions into a coherent fighting force. But they had advantages that no unified legion in Imperial history had possessed. Desperate necessity, shared loss, and most importantly, the knowledge that failure meant not just defeat, but the extinction of everything they had sworn to protect. "Our first target?" Corax asked, though he already knew the answer. "Lucius," Ferrus replied, activating the hololithic display that dominated the chamber's center. The forge world materialized before them in perfect detail, a planet-sized factory complex that had been churning out weapons for the traitor cause since the massacre at Isstvan 5. Iron Warriors garrison, Mechanicum forge complexes, and according to our intelligence, pre-heresy weapon stockpiles that Perturabo hasn't yet discovered. Vulcan leaned forward, studying the defensive positions with the eye of a master siege smith. "Those orbital platforms will be problematic, and the planetary shield generators will be handled," Ferrus said with quiet confidence. "We have assets on the ground that Perturabo doesn't know about." The planning session lasted 16 hours. When it ended, they had crafted something that was part military operation, part technological revolution, and part spiritual crusade. The assault on Lucius would demonstrate to the galaxy that the loyalist cause was not just surviving, it was ascending. 3 weeks later, the combined fleet of the Forge-born hung in the void at the edge of the Lucius system, watching sensor readings that painted an impossible picture. The Iron Warriors had turned the Forge world into a fortress that could have held off a dozen legions. Orbital defense platforms bristled with weapons that could crack battle barges. The planetary surface was covered with void shields that could deflect anything short of an exterminatus bombardment. It should have been impregnable. But the Iron Warriors had made one critical error. They had assumed they were facing a conventional enemy. "Phase 1, Ferrus commanded from the bridge of the Hand of Iron. "Shadow strike." The Raven Guard moved first, their ships sliding through the void like daggers made of darkness. Corax had spent 2 decades perfecting stealth technology that could hide entire fleets from conventional sensors. But the modifications Ferrus had made to their systems went beyond stealth. They actively confused reality itself, creating false sensor readings that showed loyalist forces attacking from 6 different directions simultaneously. The Iron Warriors responded exactly as Ferrus had predicted, concentrating their defenses against the apparent largest threat, while the real strike force approached from the system's nadir. By the time they realized their error, salamander drop pods were already burning through the atmosphere toward the planetary shield generators. Vulcan led the assault personally, his massive form smashing through defensive positions with the unstoppable force of a meteor strike. But it wasn't just his physical presence that broke the Iron Warrior's defense. It was the weapons his sons carried. Every bolt round inscribed with the anti-corruption patterns Ferrus had perfected. Every melter charge designed to cleanse as well as destroy. The Iron Warriors had been expecting a siege. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that turned their own fortifications against them, whose very presence began to unravel the chaos corruptions that had strengthened their positions. "Phase 2, Ferrus commanded, as the planetary shields flickered and died. "Purge and cleanse." The main assault began with a precision that would have impressed even Horus at the height of his tactical genius. Iron Hand's heavy assault troops landed at the primary forge complexes, their Gorgon pattern war machines shrugging off defensive fire that should have stopped them cold. Raven Guard infiltration units appeared inside the orbital defense platforms, their presence announced only by the sounds of critical systems failing. Salamander battle groups carved through defensive lines with weapons that burned brighter than stars. But the real surprise came when the Forge World's communication arrays began broadcasting messages that no Iron Warrior had authorized. "This is Lord Commander Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children," the transmission crackled across every frequency. "All forces currently garrisoning Lucius are ordered to stand down immediately. Lord Perturabo's strategic objectives have been revised." The confusion that followed lasted exactly long enough for the Forge-born to complete their breakthrough. Iron Warriors' units hesitated, waiting for confirmation of orders that made no sense. Some followed Fulgrim's apparent authority. Others opened fire on their own allies, believing them to be compromised by enemy infiltration. In the chaos, organized resistance collapsed. Ferrus stood in the primary Forge Cathedral 6 hours later, surrounded by technology that represented the pinnacle of Imperial engineering. The pre-heresy weapons caches were even more extensive than their intelligence had suggested. Entire armories of equipment that had been designed during the Great Crusade's height, when humanity had reached for the very stars themselves. "Brother!" Vulcan's voice carried across the vast chamber, filled with something approaching awe. "Look at this." The Salamander's Primarch stood before a manufacturing bay that seemed to stretch to infinity, its assembly lines designed to produce weapons that existed at the very edge of human understanding. plasma cannons that could burn through void shields, melter charges that could crack continent-sized fortifications, and in the center of it all, a forge complex that bore the personal mark of the Emperor himself. He knew, Ferrus breathed, understanding flooding through him like revelation. Our father knew this day would come. He prepared for it. The weapons they found in those hidden vaults would arm 3 legions with equipment that surpassed anything in their current inventories. More importantly, the manufacturing facilities would allow them to produce such weapons in quantities that could shift the balance of the entire war. But the most valuable discovery came when Corax's teams breached the central data vault. The intelligence they found there painted a picture of traitor operations that stretched across half the galaxy. Supply routes, garrison strengths, most crucially, the locations of other Forge worlds that had been converted to serve the rebellion. This changes everything, Corax said, studying the intelligence summaries with the expression of a predator who had just scented blood. We're not just disrupting their operations anymore. We can systematically dismantle their entire logistics network. Ferrus nodded, feeling the weight of possibilities settling around him like armor. For months, the Forgeborn had been playing a defensive game, surviving, adapting, inflicting what damage they could while avoiding decisive battle. But Lucius had proven something that would echo throughout the galaxy. The Loyalists could not only fight Horus's rebellion, they could beat it. That night, as the Forge-born fleets prepared to depart with their captured prizes, Ferrus received a message through the same encrypted channels that had carried Fulgrim's earlier communications. Brother, the performance of my sons during today's operation was adequate, though their enthusiasm for the old causes has notably diminished. I believe rehabilitation may be possible with proper motivation. Your brother in warfare, no longer in doubt. F. Ferrus read the message 3 times before composing his reply. Fulgrim, your assistance saved thousands of lives today. When you are ready to make your choice public, you will find us prepared to welcome our brother home. F. As the Hand of Iron set course for the next target on their list, Ferrus allowed himself something he hadn't felt since before the heresy began. Confidence. Not arrogance, not false hope, but the quiet certainty of a craftsman who had finally found the right tool for the job at hand. Horus had spent months believing that the drop site massacre had broken the Loyalist resistance. Instead, it had forged them into something the War Master had never imagined and could never truly counter. The shattered legions were dead. In their place stood something new, something united, something that remembered both their oaths and their purpose. The Forge-born had announced themselves to the galaxy, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 9. The Price of Perfection. The dead world had no name, only a designation in imperial star charts, Tertius 9, a mining colony that had exhausted its resources and been abandoned 2 centuries before the Great Crusade reached its borders. Now it served as the perfect meeting place for 2 brothers who had spent months dancing around the edges of reconciliation. Fulgrim stood alone on the planet's shattered surface, watching the distant star that had once brought life to this place, but now provided only enough light to see by. His honor guard waited in orbit, as did the single Iron Hand's strike cruiser that had brought his brother to this desolate rendezvous. Some conversations, he had learned, required absolute privacy. The sound of heavy footsteps on broken stone announced Ferrus's approach before his massive form emerged from the shadows of a collapsed mining facility. The Gorgon moved with the careful precision of a man who trusted nothing and expected everything, but his weapons remained sheathed. That small gesture meant more to Fulgrim than any declaration of faith. Brother, Ferrus said simply, stopping 10 paces away. Close enough for conversation, far enough to react if this proved to be another betrayal. "Ferrus." Fulgrim studied his brother's face, noting the lines that months of guerrilla warfare had carved into features that had once seemed timeless. "You received my message. The one about information too sensitive for encrypted channels?" "Yes." Ferrus folded his arms, his necrodermis hands gleaming dully in the weak starlight. "Though I confess, after everything that has passed between us, I find myself wondering if this is wisdom or folly." Fulgrim couldn't blame him for the wariness. Trust, once shattered, was harder to rebuild than the most complex machinery. But what he carried in his mind was too important for doubt, too crucial for the careful dance of messages and favors they had been performing for months. "Horus plans to attack Terra through the webway," he said without preamble. "Not just the palace defenses, the Emperor's secret project beneath the throne room itself." The words hung between them like an execution sentence. Ferrus's expression shifted through disbelief, calculation, and finally grim understanding. "You're certain?" "I was present at the planning sessions. Magnus the Red has been cooperating with the assault preparations. His knowledge of the warp, combined with Horus's strategic genius." Fulgrim shook his head. "Our father's greatest work could become his undoing." Ferrus was quiet for a long moment, his tactical mind processing the implications. The Imperial Palace's defenses were designed to withstand any conventional assault. But an attack through the webway would bypass every wall, every gun, every carefully prepared killing ground. It would strike at the heart of the Imperium like a blade through silk. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why tell me this? Why risk everything to warn us?" "Because," Fulgrim said, and his voice carried the weight of months of careful decision-making, "I remember who I used to be, and I remember who I swore to serve." He reached into his armor and withdrew a data crystal, its surface gleaming with the complex patterns that marked it as containing the highest level of Imperial intelligence. Assault plans, timetables, force dispositions, everything Horus shared with his inner circle. Ferrus stared at the crystal as though it were a viper. "If you give me that information, there is no going back. Horus will know who betrayed him. Your life in the traitor camp will be over." "My life in the traitor camp was over the moment I remembered my honor," Fulgrim replied. "The only question now is whether I die as a coward or as a servant of the throne." Ferrus took the crystal, with hands that had once shaped the greatest weapons in the galaxy, now trembling slightly with the weight of what they held. This intelligence, it could save the Imperium. It could, but only if you can get it to Terra in time, and only if someone is willing to hold the line while our father prepares his defenses. Fulgrim met his brother's eyes directly. "The Emperor's children who remain loyal to me number perhaps 20,000. Not enough to change the outcome of the war, but perhaps enough to delay Horus long enough for what matters. You're talking about a sacrificial action. I'm talking about remembering what we were made for." Fulgrim's voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found his purpose. "We were never meant to rule the galaxy, Ferrus. We were meant to serve those who could." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours, 2 Primarch's planning operations that would reshape the war, while the dead world turned beneath its dying star. When they parted, it was with the understanding that they might never see each other again, but also with the knowledge that their brotherhood had been reforged in the fires of shared purpose. 3 days later, the Emperor's Children fleet hung in the void above Kondax, watching scanner readings that painted a picture of inevitable civil war. Eidolon's forces had been gathering strength since Lucius, drawing to themselves every ship and warrior who had embraced the gifts that chaos offered. Now they faced their Primarch's loyalists across a few thousand kilometers of empty space, preparing for a battle that would determine the Third Legion's ultimate fate. "Lord Primarch," Captain Virusian reported, his voice carrying the steady calm that had made him invaluable during these months of division. "Lord Commander Eidolon is broadcasting on all frequencies. Shall I patch him through?" "Yes," Fulgrim said, though every instinct screamed against it. Some confrontations could not be avoided, only endured. Eidolon's image materialized in the pride of the Emperor's hololithic display, and Fulgrim had to suppress a shudder at what his former Lord Commander had become. Chaos had not just marked him. It had remade him into something that was beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman. His voice carried harmonics that made the bridge crew step backward involuntarily. "My Lord Primarch," Eidolon said, and the title dripped with mockery. "How good to see you again. I trust you have reconsidered your unfortunate recent choices." "I have," Fulgrim replied, "and I find them more necessary than ever." Eidolon's perfect features twisted into something that might have been disappointment or hunger. "Then you force me to claim what should have been mine long ago. The Prince of Excess grows tired of waiting for his chosen champion to accept his gifts. If you will not serve willingly, then another must take your place." The transformation began as he spoke, reality warping around Eidolon's form, as powers older than humanity reshaped him according to their desires. Wings of silk and shadow erupted from his back. His perfect features flowed like liquid marble, becoming something that was painful to look upon directly. When the change completed, what had once been a space marine now stood revealed as something that belonged in the deepest hells of ancient mythology. "Behold, the demon prince that had once been," Eidolon declared, his voice now carrying frequencies that made the pride of the Emperor's hull ring like a struck bell. "Behold what perfection truly looks like." Fulgrim looked upon the monster his former son had become, and felt only sadness. "I see what I was meant to become, and I thank the Emperor that I found the strength to choose otherwise." The battle that followed was brief, vicious, and decisive. The demon prince's forces fought with the fury of the truly damned, their weapons carrying the blessing of dark powers that laughed at conventional defenses. But they faced an enemy that had learned to weaponize purity itself, whose every shot carried the mathematical certainty of order imposed upon chaos. Where the loyalist emperor's children struck, corruption burned away like shadows before the dawn. Demon-touched marines found their enhancements failing, their borrowed strength abandoning them when they needed it most. The ships that had been modified by chaos influence began to tear themselves apart as their unholy modifications were purged by weapons that sang with the voice of the Imperium's highest ideals. Fulgrim stood on his command deck and watched his former son die screaming defiance at powers he no longer served. The demon prince's destruction sent shock waves through the warp that every psyker within a dozen light years would feel. But it also sent another message, one that would reach both Terra and the vengeful spirit with equal clarity. The Third Legion had chosen its side at last. As the surviving loyalist ships prepared to depart for the rendezvous coordinates Ferrus had provided, Fulgrim composed what might be his final message to his brother. It was shorter than their previous communications, but it carried the weight of absolute commitment. "Brother, the deed is done. The price is paid. 20,000 sons follow me into whatever comes next, their eyes clear and their purpose certain. Use the intelligence I gave you. Save our father's dream. If we fall before we see you again, know that we fall as servants of the throne, your brother in service, in hope and in defiance of the dark. F." The reply came before they reached the system's edge. "Fulgrim, welcome to the war's true beginning. Your sacrifices will not be forgotten, and your service will not be wasted. We stand together now, as we should have from the first. Your brother in arms, in brotherhood, and in victory yet to come. F." As the pride of the Emperor set course for whatever battles lay ahead, Fulgrim allowed himself one moment of quiet satisfaction. He had finally become the man he had been created to be, not perfect, but purposeful, not unmarked by failure, but unbroken by it. Behind them, the wreckage of Eidolon's rebellion drifted in the void, a monument to the price of choosing power over purpose. Ahead lay Terra and the Emperor, and the final test of everything they had fought to preserve. The Phoenician had been reborn at last. Now it remained to be seen whether that rebirth had come in time. Chapter 10. The Siege Delayed. The assault began at 17 different locations simultaneously, each strike calculated to inflict maximum strategic damage while avoiding the kind of pitched battle that would favor superior numbers. Horus stood in the strategium of the vengeful spirit, watching tactical displays that painted a picture of his carefully constructed war machine coming apart at the joints. In the span of 6 hours, the Loyalists had destroyed 3 major supply depots, crippled 2 forge worlds, and eliminated the fleet staging areas that were supposed to support the final assault on Terra. "How?" he asked Malaghurst, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a general whose perfect strategy was crumbling in real time. How did they know where to strike? His equerry studied the tactical summaries with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces kept changing shape. "The intelligence appears comprehensive, Warmaster. Not just target locations, but optimal approach vectors, defensive blind spots, timing windows for maximum effect. This suggests either deep infiltration of our planning networks or what?" Malaghurst hesitated, then continued with the careful precision of a man delivering news that might cost him his life. "Or someone with access to our highest-level strategic planning has provided the information to enemy forces." The silence that followed was absolute. Around the strategium, officers who had served with Horus for decades found themselves studying tactical displays with sudden, intense interest. No one wanted to be caught looking at their war master when he was processing the implications of betrayal at the highest levels. When Horus spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that made the ship's hull ring like a struck bell. "Summon the other Primarchs, all of them. We need to discuss adjustments to our timeline." 3 hours later, the Vengeful Spirit's primary council chamber hosted a meeting that would have been unthinkable at the war's beginning. 9 Primarchs, who had once stood united, now gathered with the wary tension of predators, unsure of their pack's hierarchy. Perturabo arrived first, his massive form radiating the cold precision that had made him the Imperium's greatest siege master. Behind him came Angron, the Red Angel's presence filling the chamber with barely contained violence that made even his brothers shift uncomfortably. Mortarion materialized from shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been, bringing with him the scent of poison and decay. Lorgar entered with the measured pace of a man who believed himself to be fate's chosen instrument. Alpharius, or was it Omegon, appeared without announcement, as though he had been present all along. Conrad Kurz stalked through the doorway like a walking nightmare, his scarred features reflecting visions that no sane man should witness. Magnus the Red came last, his massive frame moving with the careful deliberation of someone who saw more than simple reality. His single eye swept the chamber, cataloguing not just the physical presence of his brothers, but the currents of possibility that swirled around them like invisible smoke. Brothers, Horus began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him War Master, we face an unexpected complication. Unexpected? Perturabo's laugh was sharp as shattered metal. The Loyalist forces have destroyed 6 months of logistical preparation in a single day. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to inflict maximum damage. This was not unexpected, Horus. This was inevitable. Meaning, the Iron Warrior's Primarch continued with the relentless logic that had made him so dangerous, that someone has been feeding our enemies intelligence, someone with access to information that only we possessed. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Around the table, 8 Primarchs studied each other with the wary calculation of warriors who suddenly realized the enemy might be sitting among them. Angren leaned forward, his scarred features twisting into something that might have been amusement. Let them come. Let them bring their little victories and their stolen knowledge. When I reach Terra's walls, I'll show them what real warfare looks like. Will you? Magnus asked quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made the chamber's temperature seem to drop. I have been studying the currents of fate, brother. The paths ahead are shifting, clouded. What seemed certain 6 months ago now appears as merely one possibility among many. Mortarian's laugh was the sound of graveyards settling. The Red's prophecies grow uncertain. How disappointing. I thought your patron powers promised clearer sight than that. My patron powers, Magnus replied with dangerous calm, are not what concern me. It is the absence of certain threads in the warp that I find troubling. Threads that should have been severed months ago. Voices that should have fallen silent. Horus felt something cold settle in his chest. Speak plainly, brother. Ferrus Manus lives, Magnus said, the words falling into the chamber like stones into still water. Not just lives, thrives, and he has been joined by others who should have been claimed by the powers we serve. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and vicious. Accusations flew across the table like bolter rounds. Alfarius suggested that perhaps their enemies had been more resourceful than anticipated. Conrad Kurz laughed and spoke of visions where brothers turned upon brothers in chambers very much like this one. Lorgar quoted scripture about the inevitable victory of those who served the true powers. But through it all, Horus found his attention focused on Magnus's words, not just the intelligence about Ferrus's survival. They had suspected that for weeks. It was the mention of others who should have been claimed but weren't, others who had somehow escaped the corruption that was supposed to be inevitable. Who else? He asked, cutting through the arguments with the authority of command. Who else have we lost? Magnus's single eye fixed on his brother with the weight of absolute certainty. Fulgrim. The word hit the chamber like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even Angron's constant low growling fell silent. Fulgrim had been the first among them to embrace the gifts their new patrons offered. His transformation had been held up as proof that ascension was not just possible, but inevitable. Impossible, Lorgar breathed, his perfect features reflecting genuine shock. The Prince of Excess chose him personally. The bond was absolute. Was, Magnus emphasized, past tense. I have felt the severance, brothers. Fulgrim has not just rejected our patrons, he has actively turned their own gifts against them. The Emperor's children who follow him now carry weapons that burn with the light of the old Imperium. Horus closed his eyes and tried not to think about the strategic implications of what he was hearing. Fulgrim's forces weren't large enough to change the war's outcome through direct military action, but the intelligence value of a Primarch who had attended their most sensitive planning sessions was incalculable. Options, he said finally. Perturabo was the first to respond. We accelerate the timeline, strike at Terra before they can fully exploit whatever information Fulgrim has provided, accept higher casualties in exchange for strategic surprise. With what logistics? Mortarion asked. Half our supply depots are ash. The forge worlds that were supposed to provide siege equipment are either destroyed or under attack. We would be attempting the most complex military operation in Imperial history with inadequate resources. Then we rebuild, Angron snarled. Find new worlds, forge new weapons, kill anyone who opposes us, and take what we need from their corpses. And give the Loyalists another 6 months to prepare. Alpharius's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to children. Another 6 months for Ferrus to perfect whatever weapons he has been developing? Another 6 months for Terra's defenses to be reinforced? The argument that followed lasted 4 hours. When it ended, they had reached a consensus that satisfied no one, but offered the only viable path forward. The assault on Terra would be delayed while they rebuilt their logistics network and hunted down the Loyalist forces that had proven so unexpectedly dangerous. As the other Primarchs departed for their various commands, Magnus lingered behind. When they were alone, he approached Horus with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. "Brother," he said quietly, "there is something else you need to know." Horus looked up from the tactical displays he had been studying, noting the way shadows seemed to gather around Magnus's form despite the chamber's bright lighting. "What now?" "I have been in contact with the Crimson King, the fragment of myself that serves our patrons most directly. He speaks of concerns among the powers we serve. The delays, the setbacks, the unexpected resistance. They begin to question whether we are the instruments of victory they believed us to be. And Magnus's single eye reflected depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. And they begin to consider whether other instruments might serve their purposes better. Brothers who have not proven so. Disappointing." The implications hit Horus like a physical blow. The powers that had elevated them to their current heights were not known for their patience with failure. If the delays continued, if the setbacks multiplied, if the inevitable victory began to look less than certain. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Unknown, but not forever. The entities we serve measure time differently than we do, but they are not infinite in their patience. We must show progress, Horus, real progress, or we risk finding ourselves replaced by champions who have not yet disappointed them." As Magnus departed, leaving Horus alone, with the weight of command and the spectre of divine disfavor, the War Master allowed himself one moment of something that might have been doubt. The drop site massacre had been perfect. The plan had been flawless. Victory had seemed inevitable. But perfection, he was learning, was a fragile thing. And inevitability was just another word for hope, dressed in different clothes. Outside the vengeful spirit's armored hull, the void stretched to infinity, filled with stars that had burned since before humanity learned to dream of conquest. Some of those stars were dying, their light growing dim as they exhausted the fuel that had sustained them for billions of years. Looking out at them, Horus wondered if he was watching a metaphor for something larger than stellar mechanics. Wondered if the lights that had seemed so eternal were actually just one more example of how even the most powerful forces could burn out when they reached too far, too fast. The thought was not a comfortable one. But comfort, he was beginning to understand, was one more luxury that war had taken from him. In the depths of the warp, entities older than human civilization felt the shifting currents of possibility and began to consider their options. Horus Lupercal had been a useful instrument, but instruments that failed to achieve their purposes could always be replaced. After all, the galaxy was full of ambitious souls who hungered for the power to reshape reality itself. The only question was which ones would prove more reliable than their current champion. Chapter 11. The Iron Storm. The largest fleet action since Isstvan V began with silence. 400 loyalist ships hung in the void at the edge of the Moloch system, their engines cold, their weapons powered down, their entire presence masked by stealth technology that bent reality itself around their hulls. For 6 hours they had watched the traitor fleet through passive sensors, cataloging weaknesses, identifying priority targets, waiting for the moment when 4 Primarchs would strike as one. Ferrus stood on the bridge of the Hand of Iron, studying tactical displays that showed the culmination of months of careful planning. The intelligence Fulgrim had provided, combined with their own reconnaissance, had painted a perfect picture of Horus's primary fleet concentration. Every major traitor legion was represented here. Hundreds of ships gathered for what was supposed to be the final push toward Terra. Instead, it would become their grave. "Signal from the Pride of the Emperor," Captain Santar reported. "Lord Fulgrim confirms his forces are in position." Ferrus nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like armor. 8 months ago, the idea of Fulgrim fighting at his side would have been unthinkable. 3 months ago, it had seemed like desperate hope. Now it was simply reality. 2 brothers united by purpose, stronger than the bonds that had once divided them. "And Lord Vulcan?" "The Prometheus confirms readiness. Lord Korax reports all infiltration teams deployed." Santa paused, then added with quiet pride, "The Forgeborn stand ready, my lord." The name still carried weight, even after months of using it. Not the shattered legions. Those had died at Isstvan V. The Forgeborn were something new, something forged in the crucible of loss and tempered by the fire of shared purpose. 60,000 space marines from 3 different legions, fighting as one force under unified command. Horus had never planned for this, had never imagined that his perfect betrayal would create an enemy more dangerous than the sum of its parts. "Begin the storm," Ferrus commanded. The assault opened with Korax's signature, targets that simply ceased to exist without warning or explanation. Across the traitor fleet, communication arrays failed. Sensor networks went dark. Command bridges found themselves suddenly isolated from their own vessels. The Raven Guard had spent weeks infiltrating the enemy fleet through methods that bordered on sorcery, their stealth systems enhanced by Iron Hands technology, until they could walk through walls themselves. By the time the traitors realized they were under attack, it was already too late. "Phase 2, Ferrus ordered, and watched 400 loyalist ships drop their cloaking fields simultaneously. The sight would haunt the survivors for whatever remained of their lives. Where empty void had stretched moments before, a perfectly coordinated battle fleet materialized like the wrath of the Emperor made manifest. Iron Hands, heavy cruisers leading the assault, their guns already cycling through the specialized ammunition that turned corruption against itself. Salamander battle barges burning through space with the fury of stars given form. Emperor's children vessels, those that had chosen redemption over damnation, striking with a precision that would have made their former brothers weep, and moving through it all, the shadow ships of the Raven Guard, appearing and vanishing like ghosts made of adamantium and death. The opening salvos turned space itself into a cathedral of destruction. Where loyalist shells struck traitor hulls, more than armor failed. The very corruption that had strengthened those ships began to unravel, leaving behind metal that remembered what it had been built to serve. Demon engines screamed as their possessing entities were burned away by weapons that sang with mathematical purity. Space Marines who had embraced the gifts of chaos found their enhancements failing at the moment they needed them most. But the traitors were not defenseless. 9 legions worth of ships began to respond with the coordination that had made them the terror of the galaxy. If the Loyalists had surprise and superior technology, the enemy had numbers and the desperate fury of those who knew they faced annihilation. The battle that followed would be studied by Imperial tacticians for millennia, if anyone survived to write the histories. Ferrus stood at the center of it all, his consciousness linked to every ship in the Loyalist fleet through communication systems that existed at the very edge of human understanding. He felt the hand of iron shudder as traitor fire found its mark, sensed the Eternal Crusaders' void shields flicker under sustained bombardment, shared the pain of every vessel under his command as they traded blow for blow with an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. But numbers meant nothing when the enemy's greatest strengths could be turned into weaknesses. "Lord Fulgrim's compliments," Santar reported, his voice carrying across the bridge despite the chaos surrounding them. "The Pride of the Emperor requests permission to engage the Iron Blood directly." Ferrus almost smiled. The Iron Blood was Perturabo's flagship, a fortress in space that had never known defeat. For Fulgrim to request a single-ship duel with the 4th Legion's Pride spoke of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Or perhaps it spoke of a brother who had spent months learning to hate what he had almost become. "Permission granted. Signal Lord Vulcan. Begin the breach." The Salamanders. Primarch's response came not through words, but through action that defied every law of void warfare. The Prometheus broke from the main fleet, burning at full acceleration toward the heart of the enemy formation, where the vengeful spirit hung like a dark star surrounded by lesser lights. Horus's flagship was the most powerful vessel in either fleet, protected by void shields that could turn aside planetary bombardments and armed with weapons that could crack moons. Vulcan intended to board it. Alone. "My lord," Santar said urgently, "the Prometheus is taking massive fire. Lord Vulcan's ship cannot survive that concentration of enemy." The captain's words died as they watched something impossible unfold on their tactical displays. The Prometheus absorbed punishment that should have vaporized any ship in Imperial service, its hull glowing white-hot from impacts that should have breached its reactors. But Vulcan had spent months preparing for this moment, reinforcing his flagship with metallurgy that existed at the very limits of possibility. The ship didn't just survive the barrage, it used it. Every hit that struck the Prometheus was channeled through systems that converted kinetic energy into electromagnetic discharge. What should have been the vessel's death became its weapon, building charge in capacitors that hummed with barely contained destruction. When Vulcan finally released that accumulated force, it struck the vengeful spirit's shields with the power of a dying star. The War Master's flagship staggered in space, its void defenses flickering like candle flames in a hurricane. For just a moment, long enough, the path was clear. Ferrus watched his brother's ship ram through the gap in the enemy's defenses, its prow tearing through armored hull as though it were parchment. The Prometheus would not survive the collision, but survival had never been Vulcan's goal. Only purpose mattered. Only the mission. "Signal all units," Ferrus commanded, his voice carrying across the fleet with absolute authority. "General assault. For the Emperor. For Terra. For the brothers we have lost." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every Loyalist ship surged forward with engines pushed beyond safe parameters, their crews chanting battle hymns that had not been heard since the Great Crusade's height. Iron Hands vessels led the charge, their reinforced prows designed for ramming actions that would cripple enemy vessels, while their crews fought boarding actions in the ruins. Salamander ships followed, their forges working at maximum capacity to produce ammunition in real time, each shell inscribed with the molecular patterns that turned chaos against itself. Emperor's children vessels wove through the formation like dancers, their movements coordinated with an artistry that would have brought tears to their Primarch's eyes. And through it all, the Raven Guard ships appeared where they were least expected, striking at vulnerable points before vanishing back into the void like predators made of shadow and death. The climax came when Ferrus and Fulgrim found themselves fighting side by side aboard the Iron Blood, their weapons carving through iron warriors who had never imagined they would face two Primarchs working in perfect coordination. The Phoenician moved like liquid lightning, his blade weaving patterns that were almost too beautiful to look upon directly. The Gorgon advanced like an unstoppable force of nature, his necrodermis hands reshaping reality with every gesture. "Brother," Fulgrim called across the carnage, his voice somehow carrying over the sound of bolter fire and screaming metal. "This feels like old times." "Better than old times," Ferrus replied, his hammer crushing an iron warrior's skull even as he spoke. "This time we remember what we fight for." The battle for the Iron Blood lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Perturabo's flagship was a burning hulk drifting through space, its crew dead or fled, its gene seed banks captured for purification and returned to Imperial service. More importantly, its loss sent a message that echoed through both fleets. Even the mightiest fortresses could fall when brothers fought as one. But the true victory came when Corax's voice crackled across the fleet communication network, carrying news that changed everything. "All units, priority transmission. Lord Vulcan has successfully infiltrated the vengeful spirit. Horus's flagship is compromised. Repeat, the War Master's command vessel is compromised." The silence that followed was profound. In 8 months of warfare, no loyalist force had even approached Horus's flagship, let alone boarded it. The psychological impact was as important as the strategic one. Proof that the War Master was not invincible, that his rebellion could be brought to battle and defeated. But the message that followed carried darker implications. "Lord Vulcan reports the War Master is not aboard the vengeful spirit. Intelligence suggests Horus has already departed for Terra. The final assault has begun." Ferrus closed his eyes and felt the weight of near victory settling into bitter understanding. They had dealt the traitor fleets a crippling blow, captured or destroyed dozens of enemy vessels, proven that united they could face any enemy and emerge triumphant. But it had all been a feint. While they fought for control of ships and systems, Horus had taken his most trusted forces and slipped away toward the ultimate prize. The siege of Terra had begun, and they were still days away from Imperial space. "Signal the fleet," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that would have broken lesser men. "Best speed to Terra. We may have won this battle, but the war still hangs in the balance." As the surviving loyalist ships formed up for the desperate race to humanity's cradle, Ferrus allowed himself one moment of pride in what they had accomplished. The Forgeborn had proven themselves capable of miracles. They had shown that brotherhood could triumph over betrayal, that unity could overcome any division, that the Emperor's vision was still worth fighting for. Whether they would arrive at Terra in time to make that vision, reality remained to be seen. But they would try. Together, they would try. In the wreckage-strewn void of the Molech system, the debris of both fleets testified to the cost of brotherhood and the price of redemption. Some victories were worth any sacrifice. Some bonds were stronger than death itself. The Iron Storm had passed, leaving in its wake the promise that even in the darkest hour, hope could still burn as bright as the stars themselves. Chapter 12. The Gorgon's Legacy. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had never witnessed anything like the battle that raged within its golden walls. Horus Lupercal stood over the broken form of the Emperor of Mankind, Worldbreaker raised for the killing blow that would end 10,000 years of human ascension. The weapon hummed with powers that existed beyond the material realm, energies borrowed from entities that hungered to see the galaxy burn. For 9 months, everything had built toward this moment, the perfect culmination of the perfect rebellion. But perfection, the War Master had learned, was a more fragile thing than he had once believed. "Father," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself seem less certain. "It ends here. Your dream dies with you, and humanity will be reborn in the image of gods who understand what power truly means." The Emperor looked up at his wayward son, golden eyes reflecting depths that contained the birth and death of stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 10 millennia of preparation. "Does it, my son? Are you so certain that your allies still serve the same cause you believe you do?" Before Horus could respond, the throne room's massive doors exploded inward. Through the breach came figures that should have been impossible. Primarchs who were supposed to be dead, armies that should have been shattered, weapons that sang with frequencies that made the chaos entities inhabiting Horus's followers writhe in agony. Ferrus Manus entered first, his necrodermis hands holding weapons that blazed with mathematical purity. Behind him came Fulgrim, the Phoenician's blade weaving patterns that were too perfect for corrupted eyes to follow. Vulcan strode through the smoke and debris like a walking forge fire, his very presence causing demon-touched armor to crack and burn. Korax appeared from shadows that shouldn't have existed, his weapons already cutting through the traitor forces that had believed themselves victorious. "Brother," Ferrus said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber with the authority of absolute certainty. "Step away from our father." Horus turned to face his brothers, and for the first time since Davin, something approaching uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The Gorgon was supposed to be dead. Fulgrim was supposed to be his most devoted ally. The shattered legions were supposed to be broken beyond repair. Instead, they stood before him unified, armed with weapons that turned the warp's own energies against it, and accompanied by forces that should not have been able to breach the palace's defenses. "Impossible," he breathed. "I saw you die, Ferrus. I felt Fulgrim's oath to our cause. I broke your legions on Isstvan 5. "You broke what we were," Fulgrim replied, his perfect features reflecting the peace of a man who had finally found his purpose. "But from that breaking, you forged something stronger. Something you never planned for, and could never truly understand." The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment the heresy's tide finally turned. Horus fought with the fury of a god betrayed, his weapon carving reality with every swing. But he faced not one opponent, but 4. Primarchs, who moved with a coordination that transcended individual skill. Where Ferrus struck, corruption burned away. Where Fulgrim danced, perfection was redefined. Where Vulcan advanced, the very air blazed with purity. Where Korax moved, shadows themselves became weapons of the righteous. But it was the weapons they carried that truly turned the battle. Every blade, every shell, every piece of equipment had been inscribed with the mathematical patterns Ferrus had discovered in the broken demon weapon, patterns that didn't just resist chaos, but actively reversed its influence. When Horus's Worldbreaker struck Ferrus's hammer, the demon bound within the traitor weapon screamed as it was pulled into dimensions that existed at the intersection of order and justice. When Fulgrim's sword met the War Master's armor, corruption that had taken months to accumulate burned away in seconds. When Vulcan's flames touched the chaos-tainted space marines, they found themselves fighting not enhanced warriors, but broken men who suddenly remembered what they had been before the whispers began. The climax came when Fulgrim, moving with a grace that would have brought tears to the Emperor's eyes, slipped past Horus's guard and drove his blade deep into the War Master's chest. Not a killing blow, neither brother wanted that burden, but a wound that severed the connections between Horus and the entities that had been puppeting his actions. The scream that followed came not from the War Master, but from the warp itself, as powers older than human civilization felt their carefully laid plans crumble into ash. Horus fell to his knees, Worldbreaker tumbling from nerveless fingers, as he looked around the throne room with eyes that were his own for the first time in months. The golden walls, his father's broken form, his brothers standing over him with weapons that could have ended his existence but chose mercy instead. "What?" he whispered, his voice no longer carrying the harmonics of divine power. "What have I done?" "What we all did, brother," Ferrus replied, helping their father to sit upright. "You listened to whispers that promised easy answers to difficult questions. The difference is that you acted on them." The Emperor looked at his sons, all of them, traitor and loyalist alike, and spoke with a voice that carried the weight of infinite compassion. "The choice was always yours, my children, even when the whispers grew loud, even when the path seemed inevitable. The choice remained. Some of you chose to resist, others chose to fall, and some," his golden eyes fixed on Horus, "some chose to find their way home." The trials that followed would reshape the Imperium in ways that no one could have predicted. Horus stood before a tribunal of his brothers, not as the War Master, but as a Primarch who had to answer for 9 months of rebellion. The punishment, when it came, was not a death. The Emperor had seen enough of his sons die. But exile. Horus would spend the remainder of his existence on a distant world, accompanied only by those of his sons who chose to follow him into penance. But exile was not the end of his story. In the decades that followed, reports would reach Terror of Worlds brought into compliance, not through conquest, but through healing, of populations freed from the influence of chaos through technologies that seemed to purify reality itself. The lunar wolves became something new in those distant reaches, not conquerors but healers, led by a Primarch who spent every day trying to atone for 9 months of madness. Fulgrim was welcomed back to the Imperial fold, with ceremonies that lasted for months. The Emperor's children who had followed him into redemption became the nucleus around which the Third Legion was rebuilt, their expertise in anti-corruption warfare making them invaluable in the decades of cleanup that followed the heresy's end. Ferrus found himself elevated to a position that had never existed before. Master of the Imperial Forge. The Iron Hands became the Imperium's technological guardians, their forges producing weapons and equipment that could resist chaos influence at the molecular level. The knowledge gained from shattering Fulgrim's demon blade spread throughout the Mechanicum, creating a renaissance of innovation that pushed human technology to heights undreamed of during the Great Crusade. But it was the change in the Imperium's fundamental nature that would prove most lasting. The heresy had revealed the danger of allowing Space Marine legions to operate in isolation, each following its own interpretation of the Imperial truth. The solution was not the division into smaller chapters that some advisors suggested, but rather the creation of permanent interlegion cooperation councils. Iron Hands provided technology. Salamanders offered craftsmanship. Raven Guard contributed intelligence. Emperor's children brought artistry and precision. Each legion specialized, but none operated alone. The model established by the Forge-born, became the template for a new kind of imperium, one where cooperation was valued over competition, where different approaches to warfare were seen as complementary rather than contradictory, where the bonds between brothers were stronger than the pride of individual achievement. It was not a perfect imperium. The scars of the heresy ran too deep for that, and the galaxy remained a dangerous place, filled with entities that hungered for humanity's destruction. But it was an imperium that had learned from its mistakes, that had discovered strength in unity without sacrificing the diversity that made human civilization unique. Years later, as Ferrus stood in his forge beneath the palace and watched apprentices from a dozen different legions work together to create weapons that existed at the very edge of possibility, he reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. A demon blade caught in Necrodermis' hands. A brother's decision to choose purpose over power. The willingness to trust in redemption even when it seemed impossible. Small moments, he had learned, could reshape the galaxy if they were chosen with wisdom and acted upon with courage. The door to his private workshop chimed, announcing a visitor. Fulgrim entered, carrying a weapon that gleamed with the same mathematical perfection that all their creations now embodied. "Brother," the Phoenician said, his voice carrying the warmth of true brotherhood. "I thought you might want to see the latest prototype. The weaponsmiths believe we've achieved something remarkable." Ferrus examined the blade, his enhanced senses probing its structure at levels invisible to normal sight. What he found there made him smile. A weapon that didn't just resist corruption, but actively encouraged virtues in those who wielded it. Courage in the face of despair, hope in the depths of darkness, the strength to choose the difficult path when easier options presented themselves. "It's beautiful," he said. "What do you call it?" "The redemption pattern," Fulgrim replied. "After the forge that taught us all how to make something better from what was broken." As the two brothers worked side by side, their hands shaping metal that would serve the Imperium for millennia to come, neither mentioned the name that history would give to the weapons they created. But in the depths of the palace archives, scholars would record their work under a designation that seemed appropriate: Gorgon Class, Mark 9, Purification Series. The weapons that turned darkness into light, hatred into hope, and despair into the kind of strength that could move mountains. The legacy of a Primarch who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from refusing to fall, but from finding the will to rise again. Outside the workshop, terror turned beneath a sun that seemed brighter than it had for centuries. In the distance, construction crews worked to repair the damage left by the siege, but their efforts were guided by architects who had learned to build not just for strength, but for beauty as well. The Emporium that emerged from the flames of civil war was scarred, certainly, marked by loss and struggle, and the knowledge that perfection was always just beyond reach. But it was also something that had never existed before in the galaxy's long history, a civilization that had faced its darkest nature and chosen to become something better. The age of the Great Crusade was over. The age of the Great Construction had begun. And at its heart, in forges that burned with the light of hope made manifest, brothers who had once nearly destroyed each other worked together to build a future worthy of the species they had sworn to protect. The Gorgon's legacy would endure for 10,000 years and beyond, not in the weapons he forged or the battles he won, but in the simple truth he had discovered in his moment of greatest trial. Sometimes the most important choice is not whether to fight, but who to fight for.